Here's some help for the 2.06 and 2.07 lesson in biology, talking about the evidence for evolution. First of all, we're going to look at how new species are formed. Now, primarily we'll be looking at these items right here, and natural selection will come into play with each one of those. So continental drift itself does not create new species, but if you have continental drift separating populations and then natural selection occurs independently in that population, then you can have new species come about because of a significant enough change in allele frequencies. So let's look at continental drift first. The fossil record shows that the continents have not always been where they are now. They have come together, they have come separated, they have come back together, they've done a lot of moving. And looking at geologic time, it helps explain why there are some animals in land areas that are now very separated from each other. For example, if we look at this one right here, the fossils of the fern, they've found fossils of this fern in Antarctica, South America, Africa, and Australia. Also India, sorry. Knowing that those continents were once together, it can make sense. They were all touching, that was at one point in time one giant huge population. However, after those continents separated, those populations were now independent of each other, and then a speciation could occur. So now that there are ferns in Australia that are very, very different from descendant ferns that now exist in South America. You can also have changes in environment, and we talked about the pepper moth. This was something that was actually seen over the course of someone's lifetime, as the introduction of trains in the Industrial Revolution caused a lot of atmospheric pollution, which put pressure on this population of pepper moth. The black form became favored as the pollution accumulated. Then as legislation was passed to clean up and protect the environment, and the white barked tree became more common again, then that pressure was then shifted so that the white form of the pepper moth was preferred, and the allele frequency, how often it occurred in the population, changed. Now, the seed or the gasoline that can fire this process is mutation. Mutation happens randomly. We talked about that in the last unit, and not all mutation is favorable. Some has no effect whatsoever. Some can be a deleterious or damaging. However, every once in a while, there can be a mutation that causes that individual to be preferred, whether they can now outcompete for a food source or they're more attractive to mates. Anyway, if that mutation does have that, then nature will select for that mutation, and eventually it will become more and more common in the population. Thereby, evolution. Remember, a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. Now, the exception to this is man. This is not natural selection, but artificial selection, and we see that in dog breeding, all of your domesticated animals. One of our other fellow teachers here at IDVA, she sells bulls. That's a very good example of artificial selection. The bulls with certain characteristics are preferred, and they're bred more often to the cows. Thereby, those characteristics are passed to future generations at a higher frequency. In terms of evidence for evolution, there are at least 5 different sources of evolution evidence: the fossil record, similarities in body structure, similarities in development, vestigial structures, and similarities in DNA. Let's look at the fossil record. Here we have a pterodactyl and a trilobite. Fossils are formed when some type of an individual of a population dies, But before all of their bones can be scattered and their organic material decays away, it becomes buried somehow in sediment that preserves that organic material. Instead of then rotting, that organic material can gradually be replaced by minerals of some kind, and that record is preserved. By looking at that fossil record, we can see the progression of species from some type of a common ancestor to a present day species that has nothing to do with look like other branches that may have originated from that common ancestor. Another item of evidence is similarities in body structure. I have here examples of arm bones from everything from a human to a whale. And you can see in that whale the similarities in the wrist structure. Also in the femur. The femur would be this top bone right here. And then in the wrist structure. Even for something like a bat. This seemed to indicate that there's some kind of a relationship between them. How far back, we don't know, but that seems to indicate some type of a relationship. Also, there's similarities in development. If you were looking at an embryo of an individual, so not a plant, but if you're looking at an embryo in the very early stages, it is incredibly difficult to tell what type of individual or species that is going to grow up to be. For example, here we have a tortoise, a chick, a rabbit, and a human. Now, as they are in later development, getting close to delivery, it's easy to tell the difference between a human and a tortoise. However, up here, in that very, very first stages of development, it's hard pressed to tell the difference between them. This is another evidence that there is a common ancestor. And again, how far back that common ancestor is in time would vary depending on how closely related those species are. Vestigial structures are an important item in evidence. Have you ever wondered why humans have a tailbone? We actually have this tailbone that curves around and into the pelvic cavity. In fact, this is something for females who are having a first child need to check and make sure that those coccygeal bones do not curve into the birth canal. Whales actually have a femur and a pelvis. They are very small and not even noticeable from the exterior of the whale, but they are there. How did they get there? Why are they even there if they're not needed now? Vestigial structures showing evidence of a common ancestor. But those characteristics, those organs are no longer needed and so have become vestigial, they call them. They've recessed or not grown and developed. Here's another example. Why do dogs have those little teeny tiny claws on their feet? They call them dew claws. Well, ancestral dogs did have 5 toes on each foot, and that dew claw is now becoming vestigial, growing smaller and smaller as it's not needed and therefore selected against in future generations. Last, similarities in DNA. Now that we have the capability to totally map an entire sequence of DNA, we can see how closely that DNA is identical to other species. For example, currently, a human and a chimpanzee share 98.2% of their DNA. However, you can see how closely they are related to other primates by how much DNA is identical. And they can use this to predict how far in the past that branching occurred. For example, the orangutan, it looks like the branch that eventually developed into a human and the branch that eventually developed into an orangutan separated approximately 15 million years ago. Again, we still need a lot of fossil evidence to support this, but the DNA evidence would indicate that this is the case. That gets us to the end of DNA evidence. Have a fabulous time with this. If you have any questions, I'm always just an email away at cliake@idahova.org. Thanks.